The notice went up on a Tuesday, nailed to the post outside the Garrison Creek land office by a man in a city coat who drove the nail like he was driving it into somebody's chest. Emmett Holt stepped back, read his own handiwork with satisfaction, and turned to the dozen people who had already gathered. A widow, he announced, unwell in her mind, fled her family's protection with 5 children in the dead of winter. Anyone harboring her is holding those children unlawfully, and I will see that man charged. He let his eyes travel across the crowd. Kidnapping, that's the word the law uses. Nobody spoke. But somewhere near the back, a woman leaned to her neighbor, and a single word moved through the crowd the way cold moves through a floor. Not a name. Exactly. A direction. The mountain. Emmett Holt heard it. And he smiled like a man who had just been handed exactly what he came for. If this story already has its hooks in you, do one thing for me before we go on. Subscribe to Lone Mountain Stories and tap the bell, because these are the stories that don't turn out the way anyone in that crowd expected. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from. I read every one. Now let's go back 3 weeks, to a frozen river, and to the sound that started all of it. The sound was a crack. Ansel Gray had lived above the Wolfjaw Crossing for 7 years, and he knew every noise that river made under ice. The settling, the groaning, the long, slow complaints of deep cold. This was none of those. This was the sharp, ugly snap of ice giving way under weight, and underneath it, thinner than the wind, a child screaming. He had a rule about the valley. 7 years old, that rule carved into him the same winter the town carved his name out of its mouth. He did not go down. He did not go near the road. He did not put himself where people could look at him. He was moving before the rule finished talking. The wagon had gone through at the narrows, where the current ran fast enough under the ice to rot it from below. Rear axle under, box tilting. A woman stood thigh-deep on the collapsing sheet, shoving children up toward the solid edge one at a time, while the river pulled at her skirts like it had a personal claim. Ansel went out flat on his belly, rope around his waist, the other end hitched to a cedar he trusted. The oldest girl's wrist first, then a boy, then a smaller girl, so light she barely bent the ice. Then a boy blue-lipped and silent in the way that was worse than crying. The woman handed him the last one, a bundle, 3 years old at most, soaked and limp. And the ice quit under her feet the moment her hands were empty. Ansel caught her forearm as she dropped. For one long second the river had her and he had her, and the river had been winning arguments in that valley a lot longer than he had. He won this one. He carried the little one up the switchback trail at a run, the mother stumbling behind with the other 4 roped on his lead line like a pack string. By the time his cabin door shut behind them, the world outside was a white wall, and the boy in his arms was so cold he had stopped shivering, which any mountain man will tell you is the moment you start being afraid. He worked on the child for an hour, warm stones wrapped in cloth, skin against blankets, broth spooned in drops. When the boy finally whimpered and turned his face toward the fire, Ansel sat back on his heels and let out a breath he'd been holding since the river. That was when the mother spoke her first full sentence to him. She had been watching him the whole time from the corner, her 4 other children gathered behind her, like she could make a wall out of her own spine. Her voice was quiet and steady and cold as the crossing. "I know who you are." Ansel didn't turn around. "You're Gray." The surveyor. Her arms tightened around the girl beside her. The man who let 9 miners die on the Dorian Pike claim. They talk about you in 3 counties. They say you knew that slope would come down and you sold your silence. The fire popped. The storm leaned on the door. "Door's there," Ansel said. "Storm runs 3 days. River's faster." Nobody went for the door. Her name was Verity Holt, though it took 2 of those 3 days to learn it. Clara, 15. Who watched Ansel the way you watch a trap you're standing in. Wren, 12. Who watched everything else. Jonah, 9. Tessa, 6. and Beau 3, who came back from the river faster than anyone had a right to, and then spiked a fever on the second night that turned his skin to stove iron. Ansel had willow bark and not much else. Fever like that wanted quinine powder, and quinine powder was in one place in 40 miles, the town that had promised, in daylight, in front of witnesses, what would happen if he ever came down. He went down. 2 in the morning, tail of the storm, the back door of Harlan Fisk's drugstore, knocking an old signal from a life he didn't talk about. Fisk opened the door with a lamp and went gray in the face. "You can't be here." Quinine, for a child. Fisk stood there a long moment, a man weighing an old debt against a whole town. Then he handed the tin across, and he didn't ask for money. "The price is, you never knock on this door again," Fisk said. "They'd burn me out, Ansel. It's not that they think you're guilty anymore. It's that they need you to be." Ansel took the tin. "I know exactly what they need," he said, and went back up the mountain. The fever broke on the 4th morning, and the family that should have moved on when the pass cleared didn't. The snow gave them a reason, then the little repairs gave them another, and somewhere in there the reasons became a rhythm. Verity cooked like the kitchen had insulted her, and she intended to prove a point. Clara mended harness. Wren disappeared into the tree line for hours and came back with plants Ansel hadn't taught her, sorted right. And the children did what children do in a stranger's house. They looked. It was Jonah who found the chest, under the floor plank that sat a hair proud of its neighbors, a flat cedar box with a lock. He asked about it straight out at supper. Ansel said nothing, and Verity said Jonah in the voice that ends conversations. But Jonah had already seen through the gap in the lid, brass instruments, folded maps, and a medal on a striped ribbon. The kind the government gives a man. Not the kind you'd expect in the house of a man 3 counties call a murderer. It was Wren who found the grave. A quarter-mile up the ridge, a mound with a plank marker and no name on it, and a path to it worn smooth, walked every single day, in every weather, for what looked like years. She stood in front of it a long time. She didn't ask him. She just started leaving a sprig of pine on it when she passed. It was Verity, in the end, who broke the silence between the two of them, one night after the children were down, when Ansel found her sitting up with Clara's good coat in her lap and a seam ripper in her hand, not ripping anything. Just guarding it. "You want to know why we were crossing Wolfjaw in a storm," she said. "Didn't ask. That's why I'm telling you." She smoothed the coat's lining flat. "My husband died in October. His brother Emmett had papers drawn up before the ground settled on the grave. Says I'm unfit. Says the children need a guardian with, his word, standing. Her thumb traced a line of stitching inside the lining, and Ansel understood that whatever was sewn in there was the whole war. My husband's land patent, 640 acres, held in the children's name. Whoever holds the children holds the land. He wants their signatures 10 years from now on papers he's already written." She looked up at him. "So now you're harboring us. And I've seen enough of this valley to know what they already think of you. When he comes, and he will come, they'll believe every word he says about you. I'm telling you so you can put us out honestly, before we cost you what's left." Ansel banked the fire the way he did every night. "Storm ran 3 days," he said. "You're still here. Reckon that question's answered." Emmett Holt arrived in Garrison Creek 11 days later, with a lawyer named Crail, a writ from a county judge, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having lost anything he couldn't buy back. He bought a round for the whole saloon and told his story, the fragile widow, the stolen children, the dangerous man on the mountain with blood already on his ledger, and the town that had spent 7 years telling itself a story about Ansel Gray, leaned in like it had been waiting for the next chapter. Only one man in Garrison Creek got a private visit instead. Dorian Pike had owned the mill and half the town for 20 years, and when Emmett mentioned, delicately, that a custody hearing would put the mountain man in a courtroom, under oath, with the whole county watching, Pike's cigar went out in his fingers. "A hearing," Pike said slowly, "brings witnesses." "It does. Old men. Dying men. Men who might feel a sudden need to unburden themselves. Pike relit the cigar. Whatever he was looking at, it wasn't in the room. Then let's make sure the only story anyone testifies to is yours. What do you need? Deputies, Emmett said. And a town that's angry before I ever stand up in court. He got both. They came up the mountain on a clear, cold morning, 4 riders with the sun behind them. Ansel told Wren, quietly, to get everyone inside. He did not reach for the rifle over the door. He stood in the open with his hands loose at his sides, because he had spent 7 years learning exactly what this town was willing to believe about him, and he would not hand them one more line of it. The deputy read the warrant off the paper, unlawful detention of minor children. The irons came out. He pulled us out of the river. Wren was through the door before Verity could catch her, 12 years old and shaking with fury on the frozen ground. He carried Bo. He went to town for the medicine, asked Mr. Fisk. He saved us. The deputy closed the first cuff and looked at her with something that was almost pity. "Sweetheart," he said, "that man's let people die before." They took him down the mountain in chains, past the notice with his description on it, through a street full of people who had finally been handed the ending they'd predicted for 7 years. And from the hotel balcony, Emmett Holt watched the wagon pass and allowed himself one small private smile. He had the town. He had the writ. He had the man everyone already hated. What he did not have, what he did not even know existed, was a coat lining, a cedar chest, and a dying miner 4 streets away who had just told his wife there was something he needed to say before God got to him first. If you're feeling what that girl felt standing in that yard, you already know why this channel exists. Part 2 is waiting, and what this family does next is the reason this story has a title. Subscribe so you don't miss it. The mountain was quiet after they took him. Wrong quiet. The kind of quiet a house gets when the clock stops and nobody notices for an hour, and then everybody notices at once. Verity Holt stood in the yard where the deputy's tracks were still pressed into the snow, and her children stood around her, and she understood with perfect clarity that she was standing at a fork she had been running toward for 2 months. She could take the North Pass before Emmett thought to watch it. New territory. New names. She had done the arithmetic of running before, smaller portions, colder camps. Clara growing up with one eye always on the road behind them. Or, Mama, Clara's voice, careful, the wagon could be ready by dark. I know it could. Verity looked down the valley, at the smoke of the town that had cheered a chained man through its main street. Clara, I want you to hear the thing I've learned in that man's house, because it cost him 7 years, and it cost us a river. Running doesn't end anything. It just moves the ending somewhere you can't see it coming. She turned around, and her children saw something in their mother's face shift and set, like water going to ice. We're not taking the pass. We're going down. I'm going to walk into that courthouse and demand they hold the hearing here, this county, this town, this month. In the open, where Emmett Holt has to say every word of his story in front of people, under oath, with my children in the front row. Jonah stared. But the whole town's on his side. The whole town's on a story's side, Verity said. Stories can change. I've watched it happen to a man they call a murderer, in a cabin where he spooned broth into your brother at 2 in the morning. She picked up Bo, settled him on her hip, and started for the trail. Wren, bring your plant bag. We're going to need money, and the druggist buys yarrow. The lawyer Crail materialized at the county office within the hour to explain, smoothly, that a woman in her condition would be better served by a quiet proceeding before a sympathetic judge. Emmett's judge, 2 counties over. Verity signed the demand for a public hearing with a steady hand and slid it across the counter. My condition, she said, is that I'm done being talked about in rooms I'm not in. The hearing was set for the 21st. 9 days. Before we go into those 9 days, if you've made it this far, you're the reason we tell these stories the long way. Take 1 second, tap the like button, and if you haven't subscribed to Lone Mountain Stories yet, now's a fine quiet moment to do it. because nothing that happens from here on is quiet. They took a room above the feed store from the one woman in town willing to rent to them, Ada Fisk, the druggist's wife, who set the key on the table and said only, "My husband says 3 days on that mountain would kill most men who tried it in a storm. He says the man carried medicine down instead. It was as close to taking a side as anyone in Garrison Creek had come in 7 years." Verity spent the days building her case out of nothing, and it was Clara who handed her the first real stone for the wall. Their father had been a letter writer. Clara had kept the bundle, every letter he'd sent home from cattle drives and land trips, tied in string, memorized the way you memorize a voice you're afraid of forgetting. Crail's petition claimed the family estate owed Emmett $1,100 and attached the proof, 3 promissory notes, signed by her father, dated the spring before he died. Clara read the dates twice. Then she went through the bundle with her jaw tight and laid one letter on the table like a card in a game nobody knew she was playing. "April 9th, she said. "The middle note is signed April 9th, in Millbrook." "Look at the letter." Her finger came down on the postmark. "April 6th, from Fort Casper. 300 miles north. He writes that the river's flooded and they're held on the wrong bank. A week at least, likely 2. She looked up at her mother. Papa couldn't sign anything in Millbrook on the 9th. He was standing on a riverbank 2 weeks from home. The signature's forged. And if one's forged, then a judge is allowed to wonder about all 3, Verity finished quietly. She looked at her 15-year-old daughter for a long moment. "Your father used to say you read everything twice. He thought it was a habit. It was a weapon." Across town, in a cell with one high window, Ansel Gray got a visitor. Emmett Holt came alone, hat in hand, wearing sympathy the way some men wear a borrowed coat. He sat down across the bars and studied the prisoner like a purchase. "Here's my difficulty. Gray, my sister-in-law has demanded a public hearing, which is inconvenient, and you're on her witness list, which is more inconvenient. A man with your history saying noble things in a courtroom muddies a clean story." He laid it out flat, the way you lay out money. "So, you don't testify. You develop a poor memory. Or a fever. The morning after the hearing ends, the kidnapping charge evaporates, my lawyer's already drafted the withdrawal, and you go back up your mountain exactly as you were. Nothing lost. And the family? The family gets looked after. By family." Emmett smiled. "You've known these people 6 weeks, Gray. I'm offering you your whole life back for 6 weeks of strangers. Men have sold more for less." Ansel looked at him from the cot, and whatever Emmett had expected to find in his face, it wasn't what he found. 7 years ago, Ansel said, a man offered me my whole life back for one signature. I've been living on what I said to him ever since. He lay back and looked at the ceiling. "Get your answer from that." Emmett's smile stayed on his mouth and died everywhere else. "You know," he said, rising, "Pike told me you'd say something like that. He seems to know you very well." It was the first time either of them had said the name out loud, and Emmett watched it land and left satisfied that it had. Jonah came the next evening. 9 years old, alone, breath steaming, and he'd climbed the woodpile behind the jail to reach the window bars, and he pushed something through them before Ansel could say a word. The medal, its striped ribbon, and the small leather-filled notebook from the cedar chest. "I took them before the deputies searched the cabin," Jonah said. "I figured you'd rather I stole them than they did." A pause. "Mama doesn't know I'm here. Wren does. Wren knows everything." Another pause, and then the question he'd been carrying since the floor plank. Why does a murderer have a medal from the government? So Ansel told him. Standing at a jail window in the dark, to a 9-year-old, he told the story he had not told a living soul in 7 years, that he had been the district survey engineer, and the medal was for the Ridgeline route. That in his last winter he had surveyed the slope above Dorian Pike's new drift mine and found it loaded, a snow shelf on rotten rock, 1 warm week from letting go. That he wrote the report, filed it with Pike as the law required, and was told the spring quota came first. That he went over Pike's head, and his letter got exactly as far as Pike's own desk, because in this county everything did. That the slope came down on a Sunday morning and 9 men never came up, and by Monday, papers existed showing the engineer had certified the ground safe. Papers with his signature, dated days he'd never seen them. The 10th man, Ansel said, was named Eli. Casper Reed's crew pulled out alive, but broken. Lived 4 days. I sat with him because his wife couldn't stop crying long enough, and he told me he'd seen the report on Pike's desk with his own eyes, and then he died. And what a dying miner told a disgraced engineer wasn't evidence, it was 2 ruined men talking. He looked at the notebook in Jonah's hands through the bars. That grave on my ridge is Eli's. His wife couldn't afford the plot down here. Least I could do was carry him somewhere with a view. Jonah was quiet a long time. Then, Casper Reed. Wren knows his wife. She sells her the chest medicine. He looked up. Mr. Gray, Casper Reed's still alive. Barely, was the truth of it. Wren had been coming to the Reed house all week with wintergreen and honey for a cough that everyone, including Casper, knew was not a cough. 2 days earlier, Casper Reed, the last living man of that crew, the man who had carried Eli out, had taken the hand of this strange, fierce girl who left pine sprigs on Eli's grave and whispered that there was a thing he had to put on paper before God came collecting. He wrote it on the 19th. 2 pages, in a shaking hand, witnessed by his wife and by Ada Fisk, what he saw on the desk. What Pike said in the mine office that Sunday night, who carried the false papers to the county. He signed it, and he was gone by morning, quiet, like a lamp running out of oil. His widow pressed the folded pages into Wren's hands at the door. He trusted the child who came up the walk when nobody else would, she said. Get it to your mother. Tonight, Wren was halfway down Cedar Street when she saw them, 2 of Pike's millmen, coming out of the feed store stairwell, from the room where her family slept, unhurried, the way men move when they've been told nobody will stop them. She stood in a doorway with her heart slamming until they passed. Upstairs, the room was wrong. Neat, too neat. Drawers closed that had been left open. The letter bundle squared when Clara never squared it. Her mother counting, white-faced, finding nothing gone. Nothing except the reason nothing was gone. They hadn't found what they came for. And Wren stood in the doorway with 2 pages inside her coat against her ribs, the only copy of a dead man's confession. In a town where Pike's men were already searching, and the hearing was 1 sunrise away. 1 day. 2 pages. And a 12-year-old girl holding the only thing in the world that can burn 2 powerful men down. Part 3 is the courtroom, and it's waiting for you. They held the hearing in the church, because the courthouse was built for land disputes and the whole county wanted in. By 9 there were people standing along the walls, and Dorian Pike sat in the second pew like a man attending someone else's trouble. Wren sat beside her mother with her herb bag in her lap, both hands on it, the way you hold something that's holding you. For the first 2 hours, Emmett Holt won. He won the way men like him always win, politely, with paper. Crail laid out the promissory notes. A doctor who had never met Verity Holt testified fluently about her state of mind. A neighbor's letter described a widow who wandered at night. She had been searching for a stray milk cow. But the letter didn't say that, and the neighbor wasn't there to be asked. Emmett himself grieved his brother beautifully on the stand and offered, voice breaking in exactly the right place, to raise the 5 children as my own blood, which they are. Then he told the mountain story. The unstable woman, the blizzard, the children delivered by fate into the hands of the one man in the territory with dead men already charged to his account. Heads nodded all over the church. Ansel Gray, brought from the cell and seated under guard, looked at his hands and let them nod. Judge Marlowe, an old circuit man with a face like weathered granite, turned to Verity. "Ma'am, do you have counsel?" "No, Your Honor." "I have children. I beg your pardon? My witnesses are my children. I'm told the law lets you decide whether they're fit to speak." She stood. I'd ask you to meet them before you decide who's fit to raise them. Clara took the stand in her good coat, and she did not look at her uncle once. She laid the middle promissory note on the rail, and beside it her father's letter, and she talked about postmarks. April 9th, signed in Millbrook. April 6th, written from Fort Casper, 300 miles north, a flooded river. A week at least. Likely 2. She passed both papers up to the judge and stood with her hands folded while he read, and the church was so quiet you could hear the stove ticking. Your Honor, Crail said, rising, a child's interpretation of. The postmark isn't interpreting anything. Counselor, sit down. Marlowe read the letter twice. Then, he looked at Emmett Holt over the top of it, and everyone in the building watched him look, and something in the room began, slowly, like ice in April, to move. It proves nothing about the other notes, Crail tried. It proves I'd be a fool to trust them, Marlowe said. And this court's fraud question just became a criminal one. Proceed carefully, gentlemen. You're under oath in a church. That was the crack. What came through it brought the whole slope down. Verity called her second witness, Wren Holt. Wren walked to the stand with her bag, and Pike's millmen, the 2 from Cedar Street, straightened up along the back wall, too late and in front of 200 people. She was sworn in on the Bible, 12 years old, steady as a fence post. Wren, her mother said, tell the court who Casper Reed was. The last living miner from the Pike Drift crew. I brought him medicine. He died 3 days ago. She opened the bag, moved aside the yarrow and the wintergreen, and took out 2 folded pages. Before he died, he wrote this. His wife witnessed it, and Mrs. Ada Fisk witnessed it, and they're both sitting right there. She held it out. He said God was coming to collect, and he wanted his pockets empty. Your Honor, Pike was on his feet in the second pew, and his voice came out wrong, too loud for the room. This has no bearing on a custody. Sit down, Mr. Pike, Marlowe said, without looking at him, in the voice of a man who had just been handed the reason a mill owner attends a widow's hearing. The court will hear the statement. He read it aloud himself, what Casper Reed had seen on the desk, what Pike said in the mine office that Sunday night, with 9 men still under the snow. The report never existed, and any man who remembers different can look for winter work. Who wrote out the false certification, and who carried it to the county clerk, and what it cost, $40, and a foreman's job. Names, dates, his own shame, set down plainly. For keeping quiet 7 years because he had a sick wife, and Pike held the paper on his house. I watched them hang it all on the engineer, the last paragraph said. Gray told the truth and lost everything for it, and I told nothing and kept my little. I am dying easier than I lived. Let the man have his name back. The church was not quiet anymore. Marlowe gavelled it down twice and gave up. Pike was moving for the door and found deputies in it. The same deputies who had chained Ansel Gray on his own mountain, standing now with their thumbs in their belts, discovering they had a preference in the matter. Emmett Holt sat perfectly still through all of it, doing arithmetic behind his eyes, watching the forged notes travel from the rail to the judge's folder to the county attorney's hands, and finding no version of the sum that came out in his favor. The rulings took 4 minutes. Guardianship petition, dismissed. The promissory notes, bound over for a fraud indictment, Emmett Holt not to leave the county. The kidnapping charge against Ansel Gray, withdrawn, and Marlowe said one thing more. Off the record, looking out at the town over his spectacles. 7 years ago this county tried a man in its streets, because a rich one handed it a story. Today 2 of his children stood where none of you would. He closed the folder. Courts adjourned. I'd suggest the town of Garrison Creek think hard about what it owes. They unlocked the irons in front of everyone. Ansel Gray stood in the aisle of a church full of people who had crossed streets to avoid him for 7 years, and nobody quite knew how to look at him. And Bo solved it by breaking loose from his mother and hitting Ansel's knees at a dead run, and the sound the room made then was the sound of something breaking that had needed to break for a long time. The town paid its debt the way frontier towns pay, in work. The county surveyor's contract for the new pass road went to the only licensed engineer in 100 miles, restored by the same clerk's office that had once filed his disgrace. Pike's mill went to auction by summer. His name came off the sign. Emmett went east in a prison wagon, and the 640 acres stayed exactly where Verity's husband had put them, in 5 names held in trust, under their mother's hand. And in the spring, when the thaw opened the ground, the whole valley came up to Wolfjaw with timber. They built the bridge in 9 days, over the narrows where the ice had rotted, on stone footings set to a survey drawn in Ansel Gray's own hand. The first public work in 7 years to carry his signature, filed at the county with the ink barely dry. When the last plank went down, the crowd stood back and waited, because everyone understood without being told whose crossing it was. Ansel walked it first, with Beau's hand in his. Verity met him on the far side. Below them the river ran loud with meltwater, arguing with the stone footings and losing. "You pulled us out of that water," she said. "Seems only fair to say the rest of it out loud. We pulled you off that mountain." "You did," Ansel said. He looked back across the bridge, at Clara and Jonah and Tessa and Wren, at a town that had learned his name twice. "Took 6 of you. I was dug in pretty deep. One more thing happened that spring, and only the family was there for it. On a clear morning they climbed the ridge together, all 7, and Ansel knelt at the grave with the plank marker and replaced it with cutstone. Wren laid the pine sprig. Jonah read the letters out loud as they were chiseled, because Jonah read everything out loud now. Eli Marston, 1841, 1871, he was told the truth. Ansel stood a while with his hat off. Then he turned down the trail toward the cabin, where the stove was going and the door stood open, and for the first time in 7 years, the man on the mountain wasn't hiding anything at all. The Ensom rescues go both ways. That's the story we came here to tell. If it stayed with you, subscribe to Lone Mountain Stories and tap the bell, because there's always another cabin light burning up here. Tell us in the comments which moment hit you hardest and where you're watching from. We'll see you at the next fire.